Hello and welcome to our podcast, Kitchen Talks, with Ahmed and
Wahid.
Yes. So this podcast will be discussing a bunch of different topics, but before we get into that, I think it's useful for us to quickly introduce ourselves. I'm Ahmed, and I currently study in university. I'm originally from Egypt, but born and raised in Finland. And yes, that's a little bit about me.
And so a little bit about me. I'm Wahid, as mentioned before, also a university student, ethnically from Bangladesh, but also like Ahmed, born and raised in Finland.
Wonderful. We want to have this little podcast. It's a little bit more freeform, but in essence, we'll be having different kind of kitchen talk. So we'll be talking about food as a thing that you consume, but we'll also be talking about like the societal aspects of food, kind of like food as like a idea, but also food as like how we eat it, how we treat it, and also other types of kitchen talks. It's a little bit freeform, so different habits of eating, different diets of eating, and we'll be kind of going back and forth. So hopefully you guys can enjoy joining us for the ride, and let's get to it. So the first thing that we want to touch on was different types of diets, actually.
All right, I think the easiest way to start in this topic is just asking Ahmed yourself. Ahmed, have you ever been on a diet?
As a matter of fact, I have kind of dabbled into different diets, and it's a little bit of the aspect where, like, when you're growing up, you are eating whatever is served to you in a way. Like, you're eating whatever your family eats, and like you get to the point where, like, the first time you move out of your house, the first time you have a little bit of autonomy in what you eat, you start trying different stuff. I imagine you've had a similar thing as well.
Right? Yeah.
So yeah, like that's kind of like how I first, like, for a little while I did some like keto stuff, and then I tried keto for a while, then I absolutely love it. And afterwards I've started like trying different diets. At this point currently I'm going on this like vegan diet. And I feel like that's kind of like part of the shift of like you growing up and you kind of like exploring different avenues of what you can eat in a way, not just what you are eating. Like there's a lot, there's like a world of food out there and a world of like ways you can eat, and it's a little bit of that like autonomy that comes out at the end of the day. Yourself, have you been on any particular diets?
I mean, I would like to say I've attempted, but I think even that's maybe that's an overstatement itself as well. I think if anything, I probably what I've done is just like I did keto for a little bit, but I like my carbs, man. Couldn't keep it up for too long. I think what I try generally is just to eat healthy, and so that's just combining a little bit of everything. I'm just trying to maintain a good balanced diet without necessarily having a specific thing that I'm avoiding or focusing on. If that makes any sense.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. Actually, as a matter of fact, like this is one of the things that I noticed recently with our diet culture, especially with the proliferation of like social media as like a information kind of distribution platform, where there's kind of like maybe a more widespread acceptance of these like weird fad diets. For example, something like ketogenic diet, which is not really like from the research. It's not necessarily like a very healthy way to eat. It's not necessarily like the best way to lose weight, but it does seem a little bit appealing. It's like, it's very easy to just think, oh, carbs are bad. I'll just eat anything but carbs.
Yeah, load on the cheese.
Yeah, no, precisely. And then, like, you end up eating slices of bacon between other slices of bacon and a hamburger made out of butter. Not actually, but like essentially it's like start viewing food as like all these different categories, ones that are good and ones that are bad. It's very easy to like overload on what you think is good, when in reality it's just, hey, eat what makes you feel good, kind of, as long as it's not incredibly unhealthy. Is my philosophy at this point.
Yeah, I think I agree as well. I think where people go wrong with diets is that they assume that if you're avoiding a certain type of food or something, that automatically makes it healthy. But you can still have an unhealthy keto diet if you're not managing it well. So for me, I was just like, I don't want to avoid any certain type of food just because I like having variety in a lot of things, or at least in my food. So I just try to keep that healthy instead of going for a specific type and not being able to maintain that. because I think that would be a little bit more unhealthy for me.
No, absolutely. I very much agree on that. And I feel like on the flip side a little bit, I think this is part of the reason why diets seem to be effective in the first place, is because when you do have like a diet that's very restrictive, when you do have something like paleo, for example, which is essentially just eating what people used to eat in the Paleolithic era, which is essentially just no grains, no. Yes, maybe that will make you feel better, maybe it will make you lose weight, but that's not because the diet is inherently healthier. It's because if you're not eating grains, if you're not eating cereal, you're also not eating bread or rice. You're just going to eat a very low calorically dense diet just because your options aren't that many. And I feel like that's kind of like defeating the purpose. If like the whole point of your diet is cutting down on options, sure, you're going to lose weight, but it's not because you're doing something healthier. If that makes sense?
Wait, this might sound stupid, but what exactly are the restrictions under the paleo diet?
In essence, from my understanding, again, it revolves around eating lean meats, fish, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. Like essentially what you as like a hunter-gatherer would have been eating, kind of. But it avoids all these kind of like everything since the agricultural revolution. So it avoids
like
any cereals, any rice. Yeah. It also avoids like kind of processed, like even like simple processes. So in some definitions, like cheese, for example, isn't even allowed because like technically it's processed from dairy. So like it is quite restrictive. And like the bright side of it is like essentially, but at the same time, I need to know how much I should eat. I need to like kind of have that honest discussion with myself and like be able to kind of like make a freeform diet that fits my needs.
Right. Do you think people jump onto diets too quickly?
Absolutely. I think so to a certain extent. I think it's also like this is kind of the beauty of it too. Is like a diet like keto, for example, kind of like, well, at least from what I've heard from a lot of people and even from myself, like you just hear, hey, carbs are bad. Just cut out the carbs. Stop eating bread. Stop eating rice. Stop eating potatoes. It's like it seems really easy. I feel like that's kind of part of the detriment to it too, if that makes sense. Like,
actually, I have a great story here.
Yeah.
From a little keto meal that I was served a few days ago. So our neighbors that live like on the floors above us, they near to the house, they invited like me and my roommate up for dinner or whatever. And then when we get there, they're like, oh yeah, I'm on a keto diet, so I'm going to be cooking keto food for you guys. Is that okay? We're like, yeah, sure. That's okay. And I kid you not, man, whatever they made, man, it was just drenched in butter and just melted cheese. And so, like, whatever we were served, it was like, man, it was, if you have like soup or something, you just have like that nice broth. But imagine instead of like a nice broth, it's just purely fat, man. And I was just looking at it like, there's no way this can be good for you. I mean, sure, you're avoiding carbs, but what is this, man? Yeah, funny little thing. I mean, it was also funny because the person was like, "This is the first time I'm cooking for guests like other than myself." It's like, this is great. Fun little thing.
which is like, okay, like I imagine there's some joy to it.
You glitched out for a while now, but okay, I think you're back.
I'm back?
Yeah.
Okay, we're good. Yeah, no, I think that's kind of like a part of the thing, which is like, when you have a diet like that and you start working around the diet, you end up eating stuff that's like, to me at least, very odd food. And, it's very hard to give something up. It's very hard to give up, for example. Like, actually, this is true of like most addictions in a way. Well, I don't really call carbs addictions, but like essentially like most addictions, but like it's really hard to like cut down on one vice without introducing a different vice, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Which I've noticed like in my experience, when people like will start eating keto, or even when when I started eating vegan, for example, I noticed that like I started on kind of eating very unhealthy kind of vegan food, like kind of like junk food vegan for a little while, and it's like I feel like that's kind of like comes with the difficulty of like when you have a kind of restrictive diet, you have to start working within those boundaries, and if you don't have the experience, if you don't have that kind of like understanding of working within those boundaries, you end up eating maybe even more unhealthy food,
right?
Because you don't have the experience.
What's the hardest part about being vegan for you? I'm guessing you cook a lot. I'm guessing you cook a lot at home as well. So, for you, what's in the kitchen that like you're like, damn, can't use that anymore?
Actually, not exactly in the kitchen, but I will say that probably the most annoying part is like going out to eat. It's like, someone invites you over to lunch and you have to like find one nice place that actually serves like decent like vegan food, because like even though a lot of places do serve vegan food, the majority of them have it kind of like an afterthought in a way, where like
I see,
there's like the main list, and then there's that one vegan meat.
Yeah, for the sake of that, for that vegan person that comes along to that place,
right?
They're gonna have something for you there.
Yeah, and then dude, half the time it's not even there. Dude, remember when we were in Barcelona? No, not in Madrid. In Madrid, I think. We went to this like one steakhouse place, and there was like a steakhouse. But before we went in, we asked if they had like any like vegetarian or vegan options on the menu, and they're like 3 options. I asked about all 3 options. They're all out of stock, and it's like at that point it was it was there just to tick the box. It was just there to be like, hey, we serve for this, but we don't actually cater towards them. I think that's kind of the thing, which is it's almost like an optical thing. Like it's like more about optics, less about content.
Yeah, I mean, I think this also depends greatly on where you are, right? Because I feel in Finland,
for sure,
it's still, they're still adapting. But I mean, in Amsterdam, it's crazy, man. Like you have vegan.
Amsterdam's amazing.
It's crazy, and you have like so many vegan, like just vegan fast food places. So if you want, I think also the assumption is that if you're going to eat vegan outside, it means you want to eat something super healthy. No guilty pleasures, whatever. But I think in Amsterdam they understand that you want both. You have all the healthy vegan places, but you also have straight up just junk food that's great, man.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, that's the amazing part. I feel like when I was in Amsterdam, because like sure, sometimes it's really nice to go to that like one hipster vegan place that like serves you €15 like whatever, like aubergine and like zucchini, whatever. It's like, okay, cool, very fancy, very nice. But sometimes I want to get down on like a garbage nugget made out of unknown ingredients that taste like I'm gonna go to a hospital afterwards. Like so actually, for what it's worth, I will on your previous question. What was that?
You just glitched out again, man.
Good job. Damn it. How am I now?
You're good, but I missed your last point.
I'm good. Which last point?
After I said, I think we have a lot of vegan options here, and like junk food wise as well. So your reaction to my statement?
God, I don't even remember what my reaction to my statement was.
You were like, yeah, there's a lot of options. Something after that.
Okay, we'll pretend that whatever we have there, we can cut it into something that works, and I'll skip to the next sentence that I was going to say.
All right.
Okay. What I was actually going to say was, as a response to your previous question, in terms of what I missed the most in the kitchen. But I feel like now most of the stuff that I cook takes a little bit more time. Like when you can eat chicken, for example, you literally just go get like a chicken breast, toss it on the pan, make a random sauce, and there you go. You got like dinner served. Whereas like, if I want something that's like nutritious and like healthy, like nutritious and healthy, those kind of like synonyms, but like nutritious and quick, I need a little bit of preparation. Like for example, I'll like spend the weekend preparing seitan, which is this gluten protein thing that I'll like eat during the week. I'll prepare it in different ways during the week. Like that requires a little bit of preparation on the weekend, so I can have something that I can cook up quicker during the week.
Okay.
So there's a little bit of that involved. But at the end of the day, I feel like it's something that you very quickly get used to. And also, there's a little bit of like I'm not sure if it's like a actual psychological aspect, but I will call it a psychological factor, where I feel like as time goes on, you kind of view meat as less of a food, if that makes sense. Like something changes in your brain in a way where like in the beginning, maybe you were like, oh man, I really miss eating chicken, whatever. But like after a while, it's like chicken isn't even something that like I feel I could eat, if that makes any sense. Like
okay. I guess you're normalizing to your diet, where it's like you just know these are the options that you have, and so you don't crave it. It's like it's like you know that if you want something, as you said, quick and nutritious, this like seitan or whatever, however you prep it, that's your option. And you don't really think like,
right,
I wish I had the chicken.
I think it's also like a little bit more of like kind of to add to that, I feel like there's a little bit of a moral factor in a way. Like when you are on a vegan diet, if you do generally think that like eating meat is like morally bad, it takes very quickly for that moral vice to kind of like change the way you view meat in a way. Like when you look at like a box of chicken breasts, in a weird way, like you don't look at it as like food, you look at it as like a dead animal, you know, like bizarrely.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that makes sense. But I feel like that's kind of the thing that like at a certain point it's almost like disgusting. And I don't mean this like to like knock anyone's food. Like, hey, like, I imagine fried chicken tastes absolutely amazing. No questions there. But it's still like there is like kind of like a change of how you view that the animal, how you view the food.
That's fair.
I think that's actually like for what it's worth. That's why I feel like holding a vegan diet is probably like easier. Diet, it's also like a little bit more like I don't want to call it a life philosophy, but it is like a little bit more from like a philosophical perspective, which makes it way harder to break. Like if you're eating paleo because you're eating healthy, it's very easy to just be like, man, I feel like garbage, let me switch back. But if you're eating vegan because you are kind of morally committed to it, it's, I feel, at least for me, a little bit more difficult to go back on that because, you know, it's kind of hard to change your moral opinions, whereas it is pretty easy to change your kind of personal lifestyle opinions, if that makes any sense.
Okay. Actually, another thing that just popped into my head is, you know, you have that stereotype that vegans always shout that they're vegans or whatever, like they gotta announce it to the whole world. Do you find yourself talking about food more often now?
Bro, but on God, I will talk to about anyone who's even gonna listen. Like, I am that annoying vegan who's like, hey, by the way, have you guys considered that what you eat is murder? And it's like,
so,
okay,
it's because you feel like there's an obligation. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in a way, it's kind of like, you know, not to use like a very extreme example, but like if you're actually kind of like morally committed to the idea that like eating meat is murder and it is unnecessary, it's a little bit like watching your neighbor like beat his kid. And it's like, okay, it's very hard to keep quiet about it if you know that it's morally wrong, if you know that it's like staying silent about it almost feels like you're kind of complicit, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair.
And then I feel like
makes sense.
Furthermore, too, I feel like this is more from like a practical standpoint. I don't want to like reveal my power level here or anything, but I feel like on a certain level, I expect that like in the coming like century or two, everyone's gonna have to go vegan just for like practical purposes. Like there isn't enough land to farm cattle to eat them. It's way easier to just like, hey, just eat the actual thing that you feed the cattle instead. Just like a purely like thermodynamical like conservation of energy kind of standpoint. So I feel like because most people will eventually go vegan, if I kind of bring it up more, maybe I can kind of like accelerate the rate at which that happens, if that makes any sense.
But do you think that meat is just gonna be replaced completely, or do you just think it's gonna become more of a luxury sort of food kind of thing, like caviar, for example? It might just become a little bit more limited. You think meat might go towards that direction, or do you think people are just going to be disgusted by the idea of meat?
I
sort of as like a change in the mindset.
I think I want to say that like initially, I think it's going to become more luxurious. Sorry, it's going to become like the kind of like item that like, because it will become more expensive as the human population grows. It will become like more expensive to like feed every person meat. It will slowly become like a luxury item. But I feel like on a long enough time scale, I think you kind of, there needs to be an entire system in a way that normalizes, that kind of makes it okay to eat meat for people not to kind of think about it as morally wrong, if that makes sense. Like, if you didn't eat meat as a kid, I don't think if I went up to like a random 15-year-old kid, like, hey, do you want to eat this carcass? They would be like, yes, this looks very delicious to me. Had they not been used to eating meat their whole life.
Right.
So I feel like initially it might become more of a luxury, but as it goes on for a long enough period of time that people aren't used to eating meat, it's not as normalized as a thing that you were fed since you were a kid. Right. It becomes harder to kind of like accept it as like a necessary evil, if that makes sense.
That makes sense, yeah.
Because I've noticed that too, like, I've had this like diet discussion with a lot of people. And whereas I feel like younger people will generally concede at least a little bit, they'll be like, yeah, I definitely should be eating more vegan options. I definitely should not be consuming like meat on every meal. I feel like
do you think people feel like they have to say that rather than actually believing it?
I think a little bit of both, but I do think like people generally do think so, at least to some extent, because it's very hard to like look at like the numbers behind like global warming, for example, and go like, hey, you know, climate change, a really big like consumer product that like contributes to it is. You can't look at that and go like, yeah, actually, eating meat is fine. There's no problems with it. Like, you have to kind of admit that like it's not the perfect option. And I think like younger people, in my experience at least, because they haven't been as kind of indoctrinated into this kind of like accepting system, they're more likely to give you like, hey, I should be trying. Whereas if you have this conversation with anyone above the age of like 40 or 50, and like, no offense, like I don't even mean it like as, hey, they're bad for doing this, but I feel like because they have been so integrated into this worldview, they will never even consider it as an option. They will never even like. In a way, it's almost talking to like a Trump supporter about like Trump actually lost the presidency. You know, not to get too political or anything, but like, you know, you can talk till the cows go home. There's not gonna be any kind of like understanding, not because they don't understand, but because it requires a fundamentally different worldview. It requires a worldview in which you view animals as like things that have value, and you view harm to them as detrimental. Yeah,
I think the other issue is that, like, especially for older generations, you have far too many memories, I think, associated with at least like food items and everything, right? It's a hard thing to give up all kinds of holidays and, you know, all of these.
For sure.
Right? Like in different holidays, especially, you have like I don't know, like just a whole bunch of food, you know, all different kinds, usually like a lot of meat and everything as well. And then for someone to tell you, hey, by the way, you eating meat is just morally wrong. It's like kind of like just take a little poo-poo, you know, on their whole past in terms of like all these celebratory moments and everything. But not just those, but I think just like on their whole, how they live their life. I think for like majority of their whole life. I think maybe that's where like a lot of the generational issues come from.
I very much agree. I think there's like two kind of like aspects to it. There's kind of like the personal aspect where I feel like if you are kind of like, let's say you are a 50-year-old man who's been eating meat all his life, to kind of change your opinion about it at that age, tacitly admitting that you've been doing a moral wrong for the last 50 years, if that makes sense. And therefore, I feel like you can't, it's almost impossible to change your opinion because it's impossible to go, like, you know what, I was wrong for 50 years. But then there's also the flip side too, which is like, it is really hard to change your diet, especially like if you're 50 again. You've been eating so many like very specific like dishes that like, you know, if I introduce like a tofu dish to like my uncle, for example, he'd probably look at me funny and be like, "Oh, what is this?" And like I get that initial like instinct, because it's like if it's not something that like I imagine that you'd be able to enjoy.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a hurdle. I feel.
Yeah.
But on the flip side of it, though, I will say this much, which is I feel like a lot of the time people don't want to consider the actual like real world impact of their diets. They don't want to consider the real like when you go to the store and you buy a chicken breast and you buy like a piece of meat, you don't actually think about what were the stages of production that happened to get you to this point. Like where was this cattle raised? How was it treated? How were the slaughterhouse conditions? And like what were all the logistical hurdles that happened for you to get this piece of beef on your table, right?
Yeah.
You just look at it and you're like, oh, here's an ingredient that I'm going to add to my list of like, checklist for my shopping list, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is kind of what allows people to kind of be kind of fine with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think also, I mean, first of all, I think a lot of people just don't know the extent of like how cool like the whole meat industry can be in general. I think that's the first thing. But I think the other thing, which I think plays probably even bigger role, probably why a lot of people also may be too reluctant to want to look into it too much, it's just because they're like, I don't value the life of an animal as much as I value like a human or something.
Right.
So therefore, I can just eat my eat meat, and it's all good.
Like I kind of agree with both points. Though to a certain extent, I feel like the second one kind of stems more from people a little bit not wanting to think about it, not wanting to value the life of the animal. Because I feel like if it happened in front of them, like if you saw a guy, punch a cow, make her live in like a little 4x4 meter square like apartment, what's it called, shed for her whole life, and then slaughter her in front of you, I think you would be more hesitant to it because you see the abuse. And therefore, kind of, in a way, the value of animal life, a lot of people do value it. They just don't see the value it. Like, if I went outside today and I kicked a dog, no one would be like, "Oh man, I eat meat, and therefore you think that dog is fine because I don't value animal life." Right?
Like, I also find it very funny because I think at least for both of us, like if you go back to Egypt, or I go back to Bangladesh, I've seen an animal being slaughtered.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, so I've seen an animal being slaughtered. I still eat meat. I'm like, I just try to source my meat better. Try to make sure I'm not getting something that's from, overly industrialized or whatever. At least from the butchers that I always go to, they always get them from private little farms. But it's always funny when you talk about like, so if you talk to meat eaters and they've never seen even like an animal being slaughtered, but more so because they neglect to even think about it. And I think that's always like that's always a little bit funny to me because it's like you're still consuming meat, but like really without thinking like the implications of what you're doing.
No, precisely. Which actually,
yeah. But I think also it also has to do a lot with like, I mean, as you said before, it's just like what you grow up eating and everything as well. So you learn to like not question, I think, a lot of these things. But I think what's helping this quite a lot is just documentaries and stuff, just a lot of the information that's going around. So I think people are becoming more aware of like these kind of stuff. That's also like why a lot of people, they're able to adapt to these diets and stuff quicker because they're exposed to them at a younger age.
For sure. I think like it's generally like a lot more like accessible information. There's like a lot more like resources, like this over like a billion different like forums that like discuss like different ways of like having a vegan diet. Whereas maybe like before the advent of the internet, if you were going vegan, like where are you gonna get like a vegan recipe? You're gonna go to the library and find like a vegan cookbook? No, screw that thing.
Yeah.
But also, actually, a wonderful point like about that meat thing that most people don't think about. I find it astounding the amount of people that like do not realize how like, for example, dairy is like how the dairy industry essentially works, which is cows don't naturally produce milk
Right.
their whole lives.
Yeah.
Like, they have to like give birth, and they will tend to only produce like enough cow as long as their like little baby cow is young enough to like actually need to be breastfed. And therefore, like the actual fact that like the industry to produce milk, they need to like forcefully inseminate the cow, and then when she gives birth, they need to like steal away her like a baby sheep so she can produce milk. Like most people don't realize this, and I feel like if you think about it, it's actually quite. I feel like that's the kind of thing that like if people were actually aware of it, no one I think can drink a glass of milk and be like, yes, this is good, right?
Yeah, I think there has to be some sort of like at least a little bit of guilt.
Yeah, like because that one's like the one that like I find the most bizarre because it's like to me again, milk just seems like such an odd thing to drink. It's like it's clearly something that like the cow creates for her little baby like cow, so she can get nourished from it. And the fact that like we have to like forcefully inseminate her and then see her like a little baby cow for her to like give us that milk feels incredibly cruel for something that's not even that necessary. Like it's not like milk is actually that good of a thing to have, right?
Yeah.
At least in my humble opinion, I just don't see like milk very highly. No offense to any milk drinkers over there. Actually, a little bit of offense to like milk drinkers. If you're a grown up and you drink milk, like I'm sorry, man, but like who should go somewhere like, hey, you know what? I want to have a big old glass of milk right now.
But you also probably remember like growing up, you know, like if there was someone not drinking a glass of milk at school, that was like, bro, how are you gonna grow?
Dude, this is the thing? Right? It's straight up propaganda. Like they hid away all the truth from you. They hid away all the actual like abuses in the system, and the fact that like you know what you're essentially drinking what the baby cows are drunk. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is gonna make your bones grow. Like I'm sorry for swearing. Actually, I think we're gonna have to cut that part out because this might have to be a PG-13 now. A podcast. Well, we're cutting that part.
Should we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, I think we should. We've been kind of on this one for a while.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, actually, like you mentioned precisely, they're like kind of like the widespread of these like documentaries of these kind of like information has kind of changed the way that people have like a relationship to their food, to what they eat. So, actually, have you seen any like documentaries about food recently that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I watched a lot of food. I watched a lot of food videos in general, like whether it be YouTube or like Netflix documentaries, or just like exploring new food cultures and stuff. I think the most recent stuff I've seen is just exploring different food cultures. But I think the one that I've seen about the meat industry, the most recent one, I think it was maybe a year ago. I watched like What the Hell. And that was already, I think, like quite an experience.
Yeah, it's.
I've seen it too. I mean, it's stuff like. I mean, it's. I've always been very concerned. I think about like where I source my meat from, but I think that documentary just really was just like, I'm not going to turn vegan from this, but I will definitely try to do a little bit better as well in terms of making sure I'm getting my meat from the right places.
So what you're saying is I need to get you a couple more documentaries. So you can okay, I'll put that in my notes.
Before I can be a vegan.
No, actually, there's so really the quite recent one, Seaspiracy, which was on Netflix. It essentially also touches on a lot of same points, which is it focuses on like how the fishing industry kind of like is incredibly detrimental to like the natural like environment of like the fish, like the oceans. How it's like one of the major contributors to like plastic pollution. Like this is actually one of the things, right, which is, you know, you see all these campaigns like, oh yeah, stop using straws to save the turtles. But how about you stop using fishing nets that contribute to 50% of like the pollution, the plastic pollution in the oceans, right?
Mm.
But I feel like this is precisely the kind of like when you look at it, straws aren't really the problem. The problem is that we use these like massive fishing like industry like nets, which essentially end up in the oceans a lot of the time, and they make up like a massive portion of the actual like polluting the ocean. But it's a lot easier to tell people, hey, don't use a straw, instead of, hey, you really shouldn't be using any kind of cheap fish that has been like industrially like farmed, right? Or that has been industrially fished.
Well, I think it's much more digestible in more simple terms as well, right? Save the turtles. Don't use straws. Rather than being like all in your face, like, hey, by the way, stop killing all the fish. Stop using this. Because I don't think people don't like being met with like aggression, even if it's not meant to be. Maybe not in intent. It's not meant to be aggressive, but I think a lot of this information, because it concerns such a big part of their life, because you eat food every day, man.
Absolutely.
It's very easy to take offense from it or turn away from it because it does play such a big part in your life. And I don't know,
Absolutely.
I wish, I really do wish though that like, I don't know, at least in schools or like people growing up, they question their food choices and everything a lot more.
No, I totally agree. And for what it's worth as well about the point with the straws, I think a very interesting factor here too is like who the blame is put on. Because when you say don't use straws to save the turtles, the blame is put here on the consumer. It's telling the consumer not to use straws. Whereas if the claim was, hey, stop throwing fishing nets in the ocean to save the turtles, the blame becomes on the industry, it becomes on the corporations. And I feel like the corporations have like a vested interest in making the consumer feel like they're the source of the problem instead of making the problem like the problem in the industry itself. Does that make any sense? Like,
yeah,
you'll notice it like generally with like recycling campaigns. A lot of like campaigns will be about like, hey, recycle more to save the like environment. When in reality, the majority of like environmental waste comes from like massive industries who could make
produce it in the first place,
right? Like me putting that plastic bottle in the plastic waste absolutely helps, and yes, everyone should recycle. But at the same time, Coca-Cola being responsible for like 20% of the in the oceans. Oh my God! I said a swear word again.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's gonna cut. But at the same time, for Coca-Cola producing like a large amount of plastic in the first place is probably the ones to blame on, and they are the ones who should take the initial responsibility in changing their industry, and changing the way that they handle their waste in the first place.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think kind of our relationship to like consumer products in general we should like encourage people to question them more.
Yeah.
And the problem is it does take a lot of effort. It does like you don't want to be the guy who like goes up to like someone wearing a Nike shoe and be like, hey, you wear Nike shoes? Those were created in like some random sweatshops for like 30 pence an hour, right?
Don't want to be around this guy. He questions everything I do.
It's like, but that's kind of the thing. It's like it's very hard to live under like the corners of like consumerist like society and not be part of the problem.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I don't want to like kind of make people feel bad for being part of the problem because it's not on them. Like it's not your fault that like the majority of the stuff that you consume have been produced in like less than ideal situations that might have like some amount of like ethical violations in their supply chain somewhere.
Yeah.
You're not necessarily even aware of it. And that's really the main issue is that like there's not enough information and there's not enough alternatives either.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's going towards the right direction. I think people are questioning more. And again, as we mentioned, there's a lot more information available in a very digestible way. Before, I mean, if you just go like 10, 15 years back, when I guess the roots of like veganism were like sort of like, sprouting, and people were really just like hating on them. There wasn't really much places for you to, I guess, to learn too much about it, right? But nowadays you have like 50 documentaries on Netflix that make it very easily understandable and digestible for you instead of like, a bunch of research papers that talk about it. So it's easier for like kids and everyone to understand all of this information too.
I definitely agree. I definitely do think that it's like a lot more accessible for sure nowadays. But I do think that like on a fundamental level, this comes back to like where the blame is assigned. Most of the resources that are available aren't critical enough of the actual like entire industry, aren't critical enough of the actual source of the problem, essentially. Because like I can stop eating meat all I want. That's not going to stop like industrial factory farms from existing, right?
Yeah.
And the same thing exists for like the clothes you wear, for example. Like there's not enough pressure, in my opinion, on the actual creators of the problems to kind of solve the garbage that they create. Because
it's more on the consumers to stop using them rather than like stop producing them.
Essentially, because like for example, like with chocolate, like you have Tony's Chocolonely, which is the
nice little Dutch
brand. Yeah, an amazing Dutch brand, which like doesn't use any like slave labor in the chocolate, and like absolutely that's amazing.
Right.
It gives the like consumer the opportunity to participate in like an industry that does not use like slave labor.
Yeah.
But implicit in there is that even if you do buy it, that means that still all the other companies are still producing chocolate with slave labor. And it's not like them losing one customer is going to hurt them that much. And as a matter of fact, they can still undercut the prices by way more because there's not enough regulation to prevent them from doing so.
Right.
So,
I think it's actually
the system kind of rewards them for using slave labor. Yeah.
Right. I think it's actually something I like about Tony's Chocolonely because I went to their fair, I think a year or two ago. I think it's been almost 2 years ago now. And they were talking about like, yeah, sure, we produce slave trade free like chocolate, blah, blah, blah. But the point isn't to just make a bunch of it and then sell to consumers. It's to like act as a business model for all the other chocolate producers. So they're really trying to just change, I think, the whole industry as a whole, rather than just being a company that stands out and does it the right way.
Yeah, actually, I've noticed that too. They do have like a lot of initiatives that kind of like to push towards this, and I think it's amazing. I think that's like they do a lot of good work. But at the end of the day, though, I'm still like a little bit critical of the fact that they have to do it in the first place, because this should be the job of government regulations. Like, what's the point of government regulations if they don't step in and be like, hey, if you can't have slave trade free chocolate, you don't get chocolate today.
Right. Yeah, it's also just kind of funny. No slave labor allowed in this country. But if you're going to use it from another country, go ahead, man.
Right. No, essentially so, right? It's like there's the thing with Nestle too, which like Nestle is probably one of the worst companies in terms of like just like sort of human rights violations out there.
Yeah.
And there was that like announcement that they made like a couple years ago that like they essentially said that, like, hey, if we had to like report very like detailed on like how our kind of supply chain bit works to ensure that there's no like slave labor involved, we wouldn't be able to sell our chocolate, essentially. And I feel like this is a wonderful point because if your chocolate requires slave labor, if you can't make sure there's no chocolate, there's no slave labor in your chocolate, that chocolate shouldn't exist, right? Like, it's not a good argument to say, hey, it's hard. The good argument is, hey, Nestle, you're a multi-billion-dollar company. You're one of the biggest companies to exist in the history of humanity. You're one of the few companies that has the ability, has the overhead to work on this. But no. And I think that's just like a massive shame. It's like a massive wasted opportunity.
Yeah. Maybe we should transition into a less heavy topic.
You think so?
Yeah.
I think so too.
I think we're putting a lot of people under a lot of guilt.
Hey, I would like to remind everyone that you should not feel guilty for your choices. You should feel guilty for a system that encourages and enforces global oppression. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
For sure, but I think in general, people should just question the things they do in general, right?
Yeah.
And it includes like why do you eat the things you do, or why do you buy the things that you do? It's good to question these things. I think it rounds you off maybe a little bit better.
No, for sure. I definitely agree. Actually, speaking of like questioning things too, I think a very interesting thing is kind of have you been watching much like cooking shows recently?
Yeah. Quite a lot.
Cooking shows, amazing.
Love them.
But actually, I've become like a little bit more like critical in the way that I look at like cooking shows because I don't know about you, but like at least personally, I look at them less of like as a recipe source. Like they're purely entertainment.
Yeah.
I don't want to watch like a Gordon Ramsay video because I don't want to have like cook a beef Wellington because I don't eat beef. Because hey, it's kind of cool, right?
Yeah.
But I think what I do find kind of interesting is like kind of the inherent politics of how the cooking show is kind of like created, where like what the cooking show kind of presents as like exotic food in a way.
Yeah.
And I find that really interesting because like there's a lot of food that like might not necessarily even be that odd, or that might be like, you know, maybe the majority of people have eaten it, but because you're presenting it to like a very Western audience, that dish will be presented in like a very exotic way. Like I just find it a little bit odd. And I think this is also like one of the things that like people should be a little bit more critical of. Like you should be a little bit more critical of like what you view as like food that's like odd, like what you view as like food that's like culturally different. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And for what it's worth too, there is a little bit of like, I'm not sure if there's an actual term for this, but there's like a little bit of like exploitation of like mystical exotic ingredients. Where like, if you go far enough into the YouTube recommended views, you'll notice like videos talk about like, you know, these acai berries, or like, I don't know, like these goji berries that like supposedly cure cancer and like give you a second life and a second chance at like a new future. And I feel like a huge part of it is the fact that like it feels exotic, therefore it must be good for you.
Yeah.
Oh
my god, dude, the new thing that's been popping is just like, I don't know, people taking like turmeric shots and stuff.
Yeah, it's like
bro, I've been using turmeric in our food for ages. All of a sudden, it's some sort of like new thing where you want to take like human pills and like, I mean, if you really feel like that's what might make your life a little bit healthier, then go ahead. But it's like, I don't know. Does it also break down creativity in terms of like,
I mean,
how to like cook your food and everything? Just why are you taking a pill?
No, absolutely. I agree. I feel like this is the thing too. Is like because of kind of like the modern kitchen.
Maybe that needs to be cut out. Human pills.
There's not a lot of options for like whole foods in a way. There's not a lot of options for you to actually incorporate cooking, like the plant. Maybe you put some cooking powder, sure.
Yeah.
But it's like it's not the same. You know, it's way easier to just take a pill and tell yourself, "Hey, I'm meeting my daily requirements or whatever."
Yeah, that's true.
Same way that like you know, people like pop a multivitamin a day and be like, "Yes, this is how I get my vitamins." And it's like it's actually like, you do that?
Yeah. No, I take my multivitamins mainly because I don't eat a lot of fruit, but I do eat a lot of vegetables and everything in general. But
I hate to come at you. I hate to come at you here, but multivitamins don't work. And if anyone actually can find any piece of research that like proves that they work, you can send it to Ahmed at gmail.com. Thank you. But no, like,
right. Make your case. Why do multivitamins?
The majority of the body of research points to the fact that multivitamins do not allow you to absorb the entire vitamins in that multivitamin, because your body isn't made like when you're eating. Supposedly you're again a hunter-gatherer back in the good old days. You're not going to be eating every vitamin in the span of an hour, right? And therefore, like the way that your body absorbs it absorbs a lot of stuff like independently. And furthermore, there's also like a lot of like counteracting items. So, for example, zinc can stop the way that you absorb calcium. For example, like different vitamins are absorbed at different rates and are absorbed. Some of them are like hydrophilic and some of them are lipophilic. So essentially, some of them are like absorbed better if you have like fat in your system, and others are absorbed better through water. And the different kind of ways that they're absorbed and the different like methods of absorption generally shows the fact that like when you take a multivitamin, you're probably not absorbing most of the stuff on it. Which, by the way, the creators of it know that, and that's why like sometimes you'll have like a multivitamin that has like 400% of like, your daily required intake of like a certain vitamin, because you know that most of it isn't going to be absorbed, and they hope that like a little bit will be. But I feel like that still doesn't actually cover your bases. And I feel like a much better approach, which is the approach I personally take, is that like you have a couple of vitamins that you're missing. Like for example, me, because I'm eating vitamin B12, because I'm massive one, because there's no plant sources for it, essentially. So you know, I know that I need vitamin B12, so I'll take a vitamin B12 pill. And in the winter, I'll take a vitamin D pill. And it's like just kind of like seeing what you're missing and building on top.
Right.
Rather than just like taking like a multivitamin and hoping for the best, which I mean, I assume feels kind of nice because Hey, if it makes you feel
feels
better.
feels like I've gotten my vitamins for today. Now everything else is just extra.
Yeah, exactly. This is what I hate. Like,
But
that's not at all how it works.
I don't feel obliged. I don't feel obliged to go and have an apple or something anymore.
Yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, too. I think that the way our arcade trends work, it's kind of easier to do that and to kind of just, hey, you know what? I'll take a multivitamin, and then everything afterwards that you cook is so much easier. Because guess what? Now all I need is chicken and rice for dinner, and boom, my daily nutritional requirements have been met. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us our podcast today, Kitchen Talks with Ahmed and
Wahid.
Yes. This has been a little bit of completely random topic podcast. We should try to keep it a little bit more on topic, but I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope you guys can join us at our next episode next week. Thank you, and have a wonderful evening.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.